It's this version of American history. It gets told in these neat little boxes. Black history over here, Latino history over there, different chapters, different struggles, different outcomes. But that version, it leaves out something very important, because when you actually look at the civil rights era, like when you look at who was marching, organizing, striking, risking their lives, you see something different. You see black and brown people fighting together, and not occasionally, not symbolically, but consistently on the ground, in the streets, and in the ideology. And today, I want to talk about that connection, not as nostalgia, but as truth. Now, before we get into names, let's talk about conditions. In the mid 20th century, black and brown Americans were living under parallel systems of discrimination, basically segregated schools, job exclusion, police violence, language discrimination, political erasure. There was different histories, same pressure. So it's not an accident that these movements grew. They didn't grow like in isolation. They recognize each other. When Black Americans said this is about dignity, Latino communities said so is our fight. So civil rights wasn't just like a single movement; it was a coalition. Let's talk about you know the lane most closely aligned with like Martin Luther King Jr. No Latino figure embodied this connection more closely or clearly than Cesar Chavez. Now, Chavez didn't just admire King; he molded his entire movement after him, basically. Nonviolence, moral pressure, economic boycotts, human dignity over brute force. Dr. King publicly praised Chavez and the farm workers, calling their struggle a civil rights movement, not just a labor dispute. And when King was assassinated, Chavez didn't pivot to anger or retaliation. He basically just doubled down on nonviolence. And, that wasn't really a weakness. It was more discipline. And then standing right next to him was Dolores Huerta. She was the strategist, the negotiator, the organizer, who understood something pretty critical. Like, change doesn't come from symbolism alone; it comes from coalition and pressure. Like, black churches supported farm worker boycotts, and Latino organizers showed up for black voting rights campaigns. And this wasn't charity; it was recognition. And there was another lane, equally important, equally principled. And that lane was shaped by Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm spoke to people who didn't feel protected by patience, who didn't feel seen by gradualism, who understood racism as a global system, not just a local problem. That message landed deeply in the Latino communities, especially in the Puerto Rican and Chicano activist communities. Groups like the Young Lords Party didn't copy Malcolm X by accident. They studied him. They embraced self-determination, community control, anti-colonial thinking. Leaders like Felipe Luciano understood that black liberation and Latino liberation weren't like parallel tracks; they were intersections. And Chicano groups like the Brown Berets pretty much echoed Malcolm's beliefs. That power concedes nothing without demand. Different methods, same energy. Here's a piece of history that rarely gets mentioned. All right, in the 1850s, sorry, as the U.S. expanded westward and slavery pretty much dominated national politics, Mexico had already abolished slavery. Like, decades earlier. And Mexico wasn't just anti-slavery in theory, it offered freedom and sovereignty to enslaved black people who, escaped across its borders. And that matters because it reminds us that resistance to oppression didn't just start in the 1960s. It didn't belong to one group. Black and brown solidarity predicates the civil rights movement. It's woven into, the continent itself. Language doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. Creed doesn't matter. What matters is who shows up when it costs something. Black and brown communities didn't stand together because it was fashionable. They stood together because they understood something simple and dangerous. Oppression doesn't ask for your paperwork, and justice doesn't come with a single accent. We're only here for a short time. History proves that power shifts, but alliances endure. So know who your allies are, know who stood with you when it wasn't convenient, because progress was never, a solo act. It's always been more of a chorus.